What's up, everybody? Cody Shirk here, and we're going to talk about Peru and the new mega port that they just opened with the help of China. And this project, from a U.S. Western perspective, is very head-scratching because U.S. investors and people who are aware of geopolitics aren't really sure what to think about this, because Peru seems very pro-America in the sense that it's a part of the Americas, and the U.S. has traditionally had very good relationships with the country. So it's kind of weird to see China moving in on Peru and helping them build a big port. So I think the natural reaction for many people in the U.S. is that this is a threat. We see China as a threat, and the fact that they are now building ports in countries that may be shifting towards China seems a little bit uncomfortable. So this port is called the Port of Shank Kai. It is just about 70 miles north of Lima, and it's in a city of about 60,000 people. This port itself is big, and it can process about 1 million containers a year, and it is supposedly the most technologically advanced port in South America, maybe even the Americas, but let's just call it South America. And what that means is that the port is run by autonomous trucks that transport containers all over the place. There's AI implemented to make everything very efficient and ensure the logistics of moving freight around is super, super efficient. Now, this port is being called the gateway to Asia. Of course, that's from the Peruvian South America perspective. And I think it's important for people to understand how big Peru and South America is, because as I speak from a US perspective, you don't really understand how big Peru is unless you start looking at a map and measuring things. So the coastline of Peru is longer than the entire west coast of the United States. And then Chile, which is right below Peru, is about the distance from LA to New York. So you stack Chile onto Peru and you're dealing with an enormous amount of land area. Now, this port that we're talking about is in Peru, but I want to make sure you understand that the area of land that products can be imported into is vast. And that's why they're calling it the gateway to Asia. Now, China is building ports around the world like crazy. In fact, they've built over 50 ports in Africa over the past several years alone. And on one hand, investors and geopolitical hacks like to think, oh, well, China is trying to influence the world and trying to spread their way of living. They're trying to push the US out of the dominant role in how the world is run. And that might be partly true, but the other part is purely economic. The reality is China needs to export more and more products from the country in order to keep their economy going. And in order to keep their economy growing, they need to continually increase the amount of exports and increase the amount of markets that they can export to. So the port in Lima is extremely strategic for China to open up a whole new market where China can export vehicles, electronics, and other products that China is very good at making. China also needs to bring in resources and food. And Peru, as everyone knows, is a huge producer of copper, lithium, and other raw minerals, and Chile as well. So having this port in Peru is another way for China to get resources out. Now, it is a container port, so there aren't going to be raw resources being shipped out of the port as of right now to China, but Peru does have a lot of agriculture like avocados and blueberries, and China, with a population of 1.5 billion people, is a huge consumer of food. And as the general living conditions and class of people within China continues to rise, they're going to continue to not only consume more food, but different varieties of food. So the products that Peru can export are going to be literally gobbled up within the Chinese economy. I just stepped on a thorn, so just hang on a second. Ah, that hurt. Okay, so you could probably read into this, meaning the port itself, is this a threat to the US? On one hand, yes it is, because it just shows that China is continuing to make deals around the world. China is continuing to expand their sphere of influence, and now they are working in countries that historically have been pretty much completely aligned with the US. Now, the port itself is a private port. It was funded by Cosco Shipping, which is Chinese, and Volcan Mining, which is Peruvian. So you have a Peruvian Chinese partnership to build this port, and it's a private port. But it's open to public use. So the US can use it, private companies can use it, anybody can use it. So it's pretty hard to really poke any holes in this project in terms of accusing China of doing anything really like evil. That said, the port itself, there are some complaints about it in the surrounding area of Shank Kai, which is the city there, and the complaints mostly revolve around the fact that there's going to be an enormous amount of trucks going in and out of this port with not much infrastructure to support the growth of the city, but also just the infrastructure of the roads and whatnot around this entire port. I think overall they'll figure it out, but this is somewhat typical of China, which is building these huge mega projects and maybe not investing beyond that project much. So from a US perspective, this shouldn't be a huge threat, meaning that this port isn't something that is going to really make the US vulnerable. In fact, the US may actually benefit from being able to do more trade with Peru through this port. But the bigger picture here is that China is continuing to move forward. They're continuing to make new partnerships, build new mega projects, and build new relationships where they can export more of their goods from China to continue the Chinese economic machine. And frankly, that's what the US has done for the past 100 years, and that's why the US is, let's say, famous or maybe notorious for making so many relationships with other countries, because the US needs lots of export partners in order to sustain the US economy. In the coming years, we'll have to see what happens, because the reality is the relationship between China and the US continues to deteriorate, and if China continues to have more and more positive relationships with other countries, the US is going to be in a weaker and weaker position. All right, that's about it. It's getting windy out here. I hope it didn't screw up the audio too much, but it's still beautiful out here, right? Look at that. And it's cooling off. It's not so sweaty anymore. See you guys.